Shalom, I'm Rabbi Daniel Raphael Silverstein, and welcome to the Spirit of the Torah. My intention is that, Bezrat Hashem, with Hashem's help, we will explore an insight into whatever festival or Torah portion is happening each week, and the insight will also be connected to a practice, something that we can actually apply in our lives to affect positive transformation. And so the beginning is a pretty good place to begin, and we are starting this first episode with Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, our Jewish New Year. And actually we have several New Years. Our Mishnah, an ancient rabbinic text, our first layer of Jewish legal code, alone mentions 4 Jewish New Years, and throughout the generations of our tradition, different teachers and mystics have pointed out there are various other points in our calendar which could be understood also as a new beginning in a powerful way. So really, we believe in beginning again in every moment. But the calendar is there to teach us what is a beginning, and specifically the beginning of Rosh Hashanah is really seen as an archetype of newness, of hitchadshut, of renewal. What does it mean to start over again? As Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said, L'hatchil mechedash, to start, to begin from new, to really begin over, to really let ourselves do that and not be stuck in some continuation of whatever was going on in the past. And there's a related debate in the Talmud in a tractate called Rosh Hashanah on page 11, and it's about basically which of the 2 main New Years mentioned in the Mishnah are primary. You have the Rosh Hashanah that we all know, the new year that we celebrate in the fall in the Northern Hemisphere, including the land of Israel here. And then we have another new year mentioned, which is the first day of Nisan, which actually might seem to have, in a way, a bit more logic behind it. It seems more rational, I think, that a new year would be the first day of spring rather than the first day of fall, of autumn. So when talking about the different events which are said to have occurred on each of these dates, the first day of Tishrei that we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, or the first day of Nisan in the spring, the rabbis disagree about big events like the birth of patriarchs, for example. Rabbi Eliezer says that the patriarchs were born on the first day of Tishrei. That's what we call Rosh Hashanah. Whereas Rabbi Yeshua says that the patriarchs were born on the first day of Nisan. But interestingly, we're not actually going to go so much into the differences. There is immense depth and insight we can glean from that debate. But what we're going to focus on in this episode is Joseph. Because both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, that's the people who think the new year, the primary new year, is in spring, and those who think it's in autumn and fall, they both say that on Rosh Hashanah was the day that Joseph gets released from prison. And this is what I want to focus on, because this is going to help us understand something very, very important about Rosh Hashanah. Because actually, Rosh Hashanah is very, very much about the future. Whereas Yom Kippur, which comes after Rosh Hashanah in our calendar, is very, very much about the past. And we see this reflected in so many ways. Yom Kippur is so much about forgiveness, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others, asking for forgiveness from the Creator. And that, by definition, is about things we have already done in the past. So then we can move forward in a healthy way. But even before we get to Yom Kippur, and we can do that work of asking for forgiveness, before that, we have Rosh Hashanah, which is so much about accessing our true essence, our highest potential of who we really are, and setting a course and a vision for our future. And Joseph is going to help us understand this. So to really get it, we have to go back to what is Joseph doing in prison? To recap very quickly, Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery. He's sold, taken down to Mitzrayim, down to Egypt, and he works in the house of a man called Potiphar, who is important and wealthy and influential, and Potiphar sees that Joseph is good at everything he touches, everything he does succeeds, so he puts him in charge of his house very sensibly, and Joseph becomes very powerful within the house of Potiphar, and the wife of Potiphar, let's call her Mrs. Potiphar, becomes very attracted to Joseph. She becomes obsessed with him. It's clear even from the text of the Torah, and the ancient rabbis in the Midrash add many layers to it. They say that she used to constantly change her clothes so that she would attract his attention, and the rabbis say, interestingly, that it may have worked. When it comes to the crucial point in the story where she seduces him, the rabbis are actually arguing among themselves in the Talmud, did Joseph actually intend to be seduced, to let himself be seduced? In other words, was he falling for her? Were his defenses crumbling? And the rabbis say, some of them say, that actually, yes, he had intentions to lie with Mrs. Potiphar, whereas other rabbis say no, definitely not. But that ambivalence is very important, as we'll see as a theme here, because Joseph resists ultimately the temptation of being seduced by Mrs. Potiphar, and in the process he becomes, for our mystics, for our Kabbalists, an absolute paradigm of a quality called Yesod. Yesod literally means foundation and relates to how we manage our integrity and our sexuality. That is the foundation of our personality. This is something that was very well understood by Freud, who said that our relationship to sexuality is actually foundational to who we are. So he was really talking about this point. Joseph, we see throughout all the stories about him in the Torah, is clearly someone of enormous charisma. And the question is, when we have any kind of power over others, particularly in this way, how are we using it? Specifically, are we using it for our own ego self, or are we letting ourselves be a channel and a servant for something bigger than ourselves? So Joseph starts off in the story in the Torah. He's a youth who seems to be vain and self-centered and doesn't seem to say very kind things about his brothers, and seems to be somewhat focused on flattering himself and on his own egotistical ambitions. But he matures, he grows throughout the story, and he becomes a tzaddik, what the mystics call a paradigm of this quality of Yesod, a righteous person who is in charge of themselves and their own energy, and is able to healthily channel that energy in a way that is in service of life and not just in service of their own ego. Now that all sounds really wonderful, and Joseph does succeed. He does resist the temptation of Mrs. Potiphar, but it's actually not so clean cut. The rabbis and ancient Midrash in the Talmud, they say he actually partially fails. He succeeds mostly, and his achievement is very considerable. We respect him very much for that, but it's not that he was absolutely perfect. And indeed, there's a famous verse in Proverbs that says, a tzaddik, a righteous person, is somebody who falls 7 times, but each time they fall, they get up. So it's not about never making a mistake. And it's not even about, even in this time, in this particular episode where Joseph does exactly the right thing, it's not that he gets it perfectly right. And it's not that everything he ever thought or did was always the right thing. But overall, he came out on top. He resisted the temptation and did the right thing. Now, considering that big win that Joseph had by resisting temptation from the wife of his master, one might think he was due for some good news and some relief and some reward, but actually he gets the opposite, and this is a big test of who he is and his integrity and a further maturing of his quality of Yesod and being a tzaddik, a righteous person. Because what happens is he's thrown in jail because Mrs. Potiphar says that he actually tried to have his way with her. In other words, she takes the whole story of what happened and she completely denies any responsibility at all and says, oh, it was all this guy, this Hebrew slave came and tried to have his way with me and so on. And in doing so, she puts her husband in an impossible position, because even if her husband knows deep down that this is very unlikely to have been the case, that Joseph is very unlikely to have done this thing his wife is accusing him of, nonetheless, Mr. Potiphar can't really stand up to his wife and say that without humiliating himself, without admitting who his wife really is and what her agenda really was. So Mr. Potiphar, this rich, powerful Egyptian, does something quite understandable in the situation that he's in, and he has Joseph thrown in jail. And Joseph goes to the prison, the dungeon, the hole in the ground, the pit, where other prisoners of important people in the country in ancient Egypt are held. It's important to note that that prison, that dungeon he's thrown into, is called a bore, a hole in the ground, which is the same word the Torah uses to describe the hole he was thrown into by his brothers before they sold him as a slave. So Joseph has now twice been thrown down into the pit, down into the bore, the hole in the ground, not really very justly in either case. So even if we say, he provoked his brothers in some ways by being vain and arrogant and so on, he didn't really deserve the treatment that they gave him. So he's had a lot of hard ups and downs in his young life already. Now, when Joseph gets to the prison, he once again displays the same quality that he did in Potiphar's house, which is he succeeds very well at everything he's told to do. So the person in charge of the prison, the warden, we might say, he says to Joseph, I'm going to make you my number one guy. You're going to be the COO. You're going to run this place for me. I'm going to sit back and do whatever ancient Egyptian wardens do when they get to take the day off or the year off. And you're going to do all the work of running this place because everything you do works out so great. So Joseph is in charge of the prison. He's a prisoner himself, but clearly one with very special privileges and ability. And given the situation he's in, given he's been wrongly imprisoned for something he didn't do, and given this is the second time he's been thrown into the pit, and given that he's very far from home, hasn't seen his family, some of whom he very deeply loves and misses, like his father and his brother Benjamin, given he hasn't seen them for a very long time, and must be feeling very lonely, so far from everything that is familiar or comforting to him, one might forgive Joseph at this point for just checking out, giving up, and doing whatever people used to do to distract themselves from the difficult situation that he's in before there was the option of binge watching series after series on his laptop. I don't know what people did in ancient Egypt, but I assume that there were ways that people could check out, whether it was using various drugs, perhaps even other less wholesome activities. But fascinatingly, Joseph, and again, this is all part of his maturing into the person that he becomes and part of him working on that quality of yesod, of foundation, of integrity. He becomes somebody who takes responsibility for every single person in the prison with enormous care and conscientiousness. How do we know this? Because he comes to breakfast one morning and he notices that two of the inmates in the prison look sad and worried. And of course, you might think in a prison, especially one where people seem to be on a fast track to being executed, some of them, a lot of people are going to be sad and worried a lot of the time. But Joseph really notices these two people and the way that they look and the way that they feel, and he checks in with them. And he doesn't only check in with them from a utilitarian place of, wanting to make his own life easier. He checks in with them from a place of actually caring about them. And he's quick to try and offer them help, to try and fix their quandary, which is they've had dreams, they don't know what they mean. He's going to offer the solution, the interpretation of the dreams. And this is the first time that Joseph is interpreting somebody else's dreams rather than just sharing his own dreams. And he says, as he says going forward each time he does this, the interpretation is not from me, it's from God. I am making myself a channel and a vessel for something bigger than me to come through me. And because Joseph offers that interpretation to each of their dreams, eventually that leads to him being released from prison and standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh saying to him, I had a dream, no one can tell me what it means, please can you help me? And then from there, Joseph goes on to be enormously powerful and in a position to save millions of people from famine and reunite his family, and also to sustain his family through a very long, hard famine. So back to the Talmud, the rabbis all agree. Those who say the new year is in spring and those who say the new year is in fall, they all agree that the day that Joseph is released from prison and stands in front of Pharaoh to interpret those dreams is Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishrei, the first day of our new year, the day that we stand before the infinite creator of the universe, and we, as it were, according to our liturgy, re-coronate the divine as the creator and as the sovereign of the universe, and we do our best to tap into the absolute highest possible essence of who we are at our very deepest root, and from that to try and create for ourselves a vision of the future that will help us live in the best possible way. And we see this brought out in the story of Joseph in a very, very powerful way by a detail that I didn't mention before, because one of the crucial linchpins of his whole story is that moment when Mrs. Potiphar tries to seduce him. And as I mentioned before, he is almost seduced. According to some of our rabbis, remember, his success is only partial. He resists, but only barely. Well, what happens at that crucial moment when he is on the edge, almost giving in to temptation, almost giving up everything that we know that he becomes, becoming that tzaddik, that righteous person who is a master of their integrity, their yesod? What happens, according to our rabbis, is that he sees a vision of his father. A vision of his father's face in the window of the room he's in appears to him. And as we say at the Passover Seder, Dayenu, it would be enough. It would be enough maybe if he just saw the vision of his father's face, and then we could speculate what did that mean to him. But actually, the Talmud goes into detail. It tells us what this vision of his father said to him. So we know exactly the idea behind this teaching, this event in the story that the rabbis are telling. They say the vision of Jacob, Joseph's father, says to him, Joseph, every one of my sons, including you, is going to be included in the breastplate of the high priest in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and in the temple. That the high priest is going to wear this special breastplate, and there's going to be a jewel, a beautiful jewel on the breastplate that the high priest is going to wear, and each stone, each one of these precious jewels is going to be engraved with the name of one of the 12 tribes that come from me, from Jacob, from Joseph's father. And Joseph, my son, you are about to blow the whole thing. You are about to lose your place in the breastplate. In other words, in the future story of our people, in that breastplate that represents all the brothers being together, all the tribes being together, in the future story of who the Jewish people become and what their role in the world is. Joseph is saying, my son, you have a role to play in the future, and you have something that you are destined to be part of, but it depends on the choices that you make. It depends on you being aware of this vision and making the appropriate decisions so that it can unfold in the right way. And if you don't make the right decision, you're going to lose it. I mentioned before that Rosh Hashanah seems to be more about our future, and that Yom Kippur seems to be more about our past. And we see here one of the connections between Rosh Hashanah and our future, that for Joseph to get to the point in the story where he could be released from prison, which our rabbis all agree, even though they argue about almost everything else, they all agree that had to happen on Rosh Hashanah, because something about his release from prison embodies the energy of the day for us and shows us what is possible. He was in the pit where he had been wrongly imprisoned. And by the way, again, for the second time, because he didn't deserve to be there. Also the first time when his brothers put him in a pit. And yet he is able to maintain his integrity, and he is able to maintain a faithfulness to the vision of who is the best possible person that he can be. So here's a practice based on this teaching that we can all do to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. And this is something you can just reflect on and think about, or you can actually take the time to do the exercise fully, however it speaks to you. And that is to communicate with our future self, to write a letter if you want to, or a journal entry, or some other way of expressing and communicating what you want to say to the you that you want yourself to become. It could be 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, whatever it is, that you have an opportunity to give yourself a direction. And by the way, very powerfully in Hebrew, we have the word kavanah, which means direction, but it also means intention. It's really both of these things. So we can set a kavanah, a direction and intention for ourselves to connect with the person that we hope we become. And of course, we're so much more likely to actually become that person if we visualize who that person is and we communicate with them and we start the work now of building ourselves into being that person in every moment. So may it be a year for us of setting the bar a little bit higher for ourselves so that we can move forward in the best possible way to be the best people. May it be a blessed year for each and every one of you and your loved ones, and for our entire people and for all peoples. May we see true peace here in the Middle East, and for all peoples in the world, may we see all the wrongly imprisoned hostages released from their dungeons, like Joseph was released on Rosh Hashanah. May all of our hostages be set free, please God, and return to their families. And may we see the world set the bar higher for itself in general, so that we can live in the world that we really want to and really deserve to. Shana Tova.